Thank you so very much. And, oh, there's Paul. Okay. If you want, just take your seat here. And board members, I would like to remind you, if you would please speak up when you're asking questions or if you're speaking to the agenda, so that we can hear you and so that you will be recorded loudly and clearly. Okay, Dr. Register, do you have anything that you would like to?
Well, thank you, Ms. Porter, and members of the board. And I would like to just say a few words of introduction as we get into the conversation tonight. I want to recognize Dr. Paul Changus, Dr. Julie McCarger, and Dr. Tina Stimpson, who is here to talk about the Tennessee waiver that was approved for No Child Left Behind this year, and the accountability system. And I think it's very appropriate. I think I've apologized to Paul twice today for putting them on the agenda when TCAP starts immediately. But what else do you have to do? But I think it's very timely for the board and for the general public who's viewing tonight, and for those who are on the blog to get an update on what the waiver really means for us, the accountability system in Tennessee. And so we'll get a presentation from them. I'll say that we were, several of us were in the commissioner's office today talking about, with the commissioner about our school improvement grants. Julie, I think, Julie McCarger is going to speak to the timeliness of that process, where we are with school improvement grants, which is a significant investment in our school system from federal funds. So with just with that general introduction, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you have a presentation. I'm sure we'll do questions and answers after that.
I do. I'm going to start off, and Tina Stinson will be joining me on the first part of the presentation, where we give an overview of our new accountability system and try to point out some of the changes from the old No Child Left Behind system. And then Julie McCarger will be talking about timelines for the summer and what all this means in terms of school improvement planning. So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. You should have a copy of the presentation. And everything here is very recent in terms of accountability. This, as you probably know very well, we had a process from November until February, when the waiver was approved, that we had a chance to have some input with the State Department of Education on the new accountability system. But there are still some decisions that are being finalized in terms of the immediate impact on accountability. But the biggest piece of this is going to be, in terms of a change, is we have both absolute and relative accountability now with our system. And by absolute accountability, we're talking about annual measurable objectives or targets that we're held accountable for. That's raising student achievement for all students and for specific subgroups, and we'll get into the subgroup information in a little bit. Under No Child Left Behind, we had expectations for all subgroups as well and for our overall population. But the big change here is under NCLB, everyone was shooting for a common target regardless of where they started. In the new system, everybody has a baseline. We're always looking for continuous improvement over previous years. And we're also hopefully going to reduce our achievement gap, which wasn't specifically part of NCLB. We did have accountability targets for subgroups, but now we have very specific targets in terms of reducing the gaps. And we'll see some of our district data and what this means in just a little bit. In terms of recognition of our districts in Tennessee, they can fall into one of three categories: the exemplary districts, and we're going to go through a step-by-step process, what it means to be exemplary, both in terms of hitting our accountability targets and hitting our gap closure targets, which is going to be a real challenge. The gap closure, based on preliminary data that the state gathered this past year, indicates that that's the big challenge for districts. Even if we're raising achievement overall, those gaps have been very persistent. Then there, on the other extreme, are the districts that are in need of improvement, that are not hitting either of those targets, and in some cases moving in the wrong direction. And then where most districts fell in the preliminary analysis last year, which was not an official reporting, is in that middle or intermediate category. Relative accountability is going to be the focus for our schools. They're basically going to be ranked against each other, and we've already had some conversations about our priority schools and our school achievement district, our innovation zone. The state has already started, based on 2 years of data, to look at the achievement levels ranked across districts, with that bottom 5% falling into the priority schools. And we'll talk about all of that in more detail. But we have measures that are every 1 to 3 years. 1 year for reward schools, the schools that are demonstrating the highest achievement across the state or the highest gains. And then our focus schools, which have achievement gaps, and our priority schools, which are not doing well relative to other schools in terms of achievement. That will become an every 3-year process. So the state is setting targets in the 2.5% to 4% range in terms of improvement, and we'll look at the specifics for MNPS in just a little while. In addition, we have to reduce achievement gaps. So you see the measures that we're going to be accountable for both raising proficiency and reducing the gap. 3 through 8 reading and language arts, 3 through 8 math, which those were the same subject areas we saw under No Child Left Behind, as well as Algebra 1 and English 2 at the high school level. So that part is consistent in terms of what we're measuring. But in the future, and probably starting as early as next year after we gather baseline data with new end-of-course tests this year, Algebra 2 and English 3 will be added to the process. We also have targets set for 3rd grade and 7th grade. Those are the big grade levels that we're accountable for under Race to the Top, particularly 3rd grade reading and 7th grade math. But the state will report our targets and whether we met those targets in the state report card for each of these measures, as well as our high school graduation rate, which remains a 4-year graduation rate, 4 years in a summer. And a little later, again, we will see where we currently stand on each of these measures. This slide is really the big takeaway from the new accountability system, as simply as we can make it. We're talking about raising achievement for all students while at the same time closing the achievement gap. And we'll look at an example of what that means. But that means that our subgroups that are disadvantaged, such as our African American students, our Hispanic students, our Native American students, are going to have to make greater gains in the overall population. Our economically disadvantaged students with disabilities, English learners, that for the most part, the same subgroups we were accountable for under NCLB. So I'm going to walk us through an example with a little flow chart here, and I know this can be a little overwhelming, and I know that this is an introduction to this accountability system. We'll be revisiting this over time because it takes time to grasp all of this. And it'll be a lot easier when we actually have reports from the state with detailed data to work from. But like No Child Left Behind, the first question we ask is whether we've hit our participation rate targets. Because if we don't have 95% of our students tested, right off the bat, we fall short. We don't meet our target. So that first no on the right goes to the misachievement measure, and we would be in need of improvement. So it doesn't matter how well we do if we don't have 95% of our kids tested. Then the next question is how we've done in terms of hitting these AMOs, or annual measurable objectives, our targets, in these achievement levels. Are we hitting the majority of our targets? And on the right, you see again all of those subject areas that we have targets for in K-8 and high school. So did we meet the majority of those measures? If we did, then we have achieved. We have met our targets for the achievement side of things. We're going to talk about gap closure in a few minutes. If we don't hit the majority of those targets, then the next thing we look at is safe harbor, and I'm going to talk about safe harbor in the next slide, but we still have other ways of demonstrating progress, particularly value-added growth. But the crucial thing is if we're not hitting those targets, we want to make sure that we're moving in the right direction, raising achievement, because if we fall backwards, then we're in trouble, and that's when we're going to see that if the majority don't hit those measures, then we're in need of improvement. If we're declining, there's a differentiated status in terms of the intervention at the state level. They're looking at a big picture. Are we moving in the right direction? If we hit our targets, that's the ideal. But if we don't hit the targets, are we at least moving and approximating those targets? Districts that fall short of that are going to be split up into this intermediate category, which we'll talk more about, or this in need of improvement, which is the most significant intervention where the state gets more involved.
Dr. Changus, may I
Yes.
ask a question just briefly?
Sure.
I'm sorry. The absolute accountability that we're still talking about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it for school districts and for every school?
Yes, every school will have targets on the state. At the district level, it's absolutely crucial for us. The school level is going to be more focused on the relative accountability in terms of categories, right. But every school in the state public school will have targets for all of those measures for third grade reading, third grade math, et cetera, and the high school into course exams and grad rate. Those will be part of the state report card, and those will be publicly reported.
Right. And if they don't make those objectives, then they're considered to have missed the achievement measures.
They are.
I know the relative
Yeah.
the relative accountability has categories for each thing, but
the big thing for us, one of the big changes in this system is that the state is not as interested in each individual school, except for those priority schools and schools that are categorized in that bottom 5%. That's when they're going to intervene. They're interested in the district accountability first. If districts are moving in the right direction, then we work with our schools to make sure they're supporting our goals. We work on the planning process. When the district doesn't meet its targets, that's when there's greater intervention at the state level. We're going to be setting targets for each school that support the district hitting its targets. In other words, we have schools that for particular subgroups may not have enough data in a comparison group to have a target for, say, economically disadvantaged. If they're 95% economically disadvantaged, there probably aren't enough non-disadvantaged students to have a gap. We as a district, though, have to set targets for those for those schools, and they're going to be used for planning purposes. But there's greater accountability at the district level. And that's something that we'll be working with those schools to support our goals.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, those are good questions. And then absolute accountability, the final slide here is the safe harbor provision. And this is where value added comes into play. And value added, of course, is talking about the growth of all students. 7th grade reading and math, 3rd grade reading, language arts, and math, Algebra 1, English 2. They're going to be looking to see if we've hit our targets. And by green, we mean we're significantly above the state targets in those areas in terms of growth of all students. If we have the significant growth, that will offset a particular subject area that comes up short in terms of the target. But it has to be significant growth. And then the other safe harbor measure is consistent to what we had under No Child Left Behind. A 10% reduction in below proficient students in 1 year, 19% over 2 years, or 27% over 3 years. Dr. Stinson is now going to pick this up and talk about our gap closure targets.
Okay. As Dr. Stenson said, Dr. Chang has said, I'm going to talk about the gap closure targets. This is still absolute accountability, however. We do have distinct AMOs as far as gap closure measures are concerned. Over on the right, you'll see the areas, the subjects that we need to make gap closure targets for, and the comparison groups. So there's a total of 16 for the district. So each of these subjects, say 3 to 8th grade math, we would have to hit for students with disabilities, for English learners versus non, for economically disadvantaged versus non, and for all students compared to our what's called a racial ethnic subgroup. And this racial ethnic subgroup is comprised of African American students, Hispanic students, and Native American students. Those are put together in the first part, as you will see. So we do have a total of 16 of these goals that we will need to hit as a district, and schools will have varying numbers depending on their tiers and configurations. Again, the first hurdle that we have to pass is the 95% participation rate. If we don't hit that, and we've never missed this as a district, by the way, so we don't anticipate this to be a problem, but we would immediately end up in that in need of improvement list. So the first thing we would do, we have these 16 gap target goals, is we would count the number of achievement, the gap closure goals that we've hit. If we've made a majority, which would be 9, we have to hit more than half. We then ask ourselves this question. Okay, so we did, but we still have one more thing to clear up before we make it. And that is the traditional subgroups. Did any of them decline in a majority of these 4 measures? So let's say we've made virtually every single one of these gap closure goals, but one of our subgroups, it could be any of them, let's say our English learners decline in 3 out of 4 of these measures. Well, first of all, if they don't, we're going to make it. If everybody is doing well, we're good to go. So again, one of the big things we keep hitting home with schools is you're in much better shape if you're at least moving forward. We've got to keep moving forward. However, if say our English learners or our Hispanic group moved backward in 3 or 4 of these measures, we would be in this in need of improvement list, even if we've made all the rest of these goals. However, if we don't make our goals, we need to ask ourselves the same question. Did our subgroups move backward? And if the answer is no, we're going to be again in that intermediate category. The state's not going to, or a possibility for an intermediate category. The state is going to say, okay, they didn't make exactly the goal, but they're moving in the right direction. They may be in the intermediate status. However, if we didn't make our goals and we've moved backwards, we're again in need of improvement list.
Question.
Yes.
So what intervention, or maybe you may not know the exact answer to this, but what kind of intervention then
Does the
would
state
be a possibility that the state would say, okay, you didn't move backwards, but you didn't move forward that much?
Well, I think the state is going to take a much more holistic approach to looking at the data. Let's say we didn't hit our targets, but we were 3 students off or 12 students off, as you know, that has happened with our entire district before. They're going to say, okay, write a plan. You know that this is an area of weakness. How are you going to address this?
Okay, so it would be up to us to have an intervention plan in order to move forward.
Right, and I think even in the worst case scenario, we're not going to end up, at least as far as the waiver is written, we're not going to end up in some kind of a takeover situation.
Okay.
But we would get enhanced support if
Well,
we were in.
That's a light of hope.
Yes. If we're in serious need of improvement and we're making mistakes all over the place, they're going to be much more concerned.
Sure.
But if we're moving in the right direction, even if we don't hit these goals exactly, they're going to work with us to make sure that we have the resources we need to move forward. And I really do believe that that is the direction they're going. They do recognize they can't manage all these districts and they can't manage all of these schools. They don't feel it's their job, except in the case of the priority schools, which we'll get into in a minute.
And speaking of the priority schools, if they're making progress toward reaching their goal, then
Well,
what
that
can we
depends
expect?
on whether they're going to be in priority status for a number of years,
Okay.
regardless. The calculations will only happen every 3 years. They will, of course, be looking at these absolute accountability goals. And depending on where they are, if they're a school improvement grant school or an I-zone school or an achievement school district school, they're going to be talking to us about these, but they will not be released for 5 years, from what I understand.
So if a school in the I-zone goes above the average for the system in 3 years, they still won't be released from the
Well,
I-zone?
it could happen in 3 years for our I-zone schools. I'm not quite sure of the exact date on that, but what will happen is that our I-zone schools are going to be compared not to the rest of the district, but to the achievement school district, which is the state's intervention group, and we have to at least keep pace with them. That's what they're going to be looking at.
But the expectations for improvement are going to be greater in those schools. They're going to be setting in the future higher targets
In the
because of
range.
the intense intervention that's there.
Sure.
But again, we have to see how this plays out with real data over time. I think the state, the hope is that they'll have schools that make much greater gains than other districts as a whole. But
And we
The
are.
reason I was asking that question, I didn't know if that was an arbitrary kind of 5-year that you have to be in this, I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. If the school has performed even above the achievement
School district.
school district, why would they remain
well,
in an I-zone?
I think that's probably something that will be revisited over time. It may depend on how much progress those schools have made, but it is stated, a 5-year process. But we also know that there will be revisions to the accountability plan over time as they see data come in. And this holistic approach that Tina mentioned, the state has specifically talked about the fact that they want to make decisions that make sense, looking at all of this data. This is not, there are a lot of advantages to this accountability model over NCLB, in large part that everyone is expected to make improvement over time. But the transparency is another story, because as you see from these flowcharts, there are a lot of steps along the way that it gets real complex.
So the point wasn't to make it more simple.
No, it wasn't.
Right? But I have a question about the gap closure. From time to
Okay.
time, I may stop and be sure I'm following, because this
Sure.
is, okay. So on the gap closure measures, still in absolute accountability, which applies to each school, but is primarily the school district accountability measure, right? The various gaps that they measure to look to close are the racial ethnic groups compared to all students, right?
Right.
So if 80% of all students are proficient or advanced, and 30% of some racial ethnic group are proficient or advanced, then we need to close that gap. And the goal is 6.25%, right? Okay. Now, in the economically disadvantaged subgroup, those aren't compared to all students. It's compared to the non-economically disadvantaged
Exactly,
students, right?
yes.
And same with English learners, they're compared to non-English learners.
Correct.
And students with disabilities are compared not to all, but students without
Without
disability, or
disabilities.
the students who don't fall into the category of students with disabilities, right?
Right.
Correct.
Okay. Now, I have no idea how those measures will play out, but that's different from each other, right? I mean,
They are.
once we get numbers and we get a year or two in,
We're
there's
going to
gonna
look
be.
at some numbers in a few minutes from last year that the state has provided, but conceptually it is different. In the initial draft that was released, the initial waiver application in November, the comparison for the ethnic subgroups were individual subgroups compared to white students. That changed, and there was a lot of give and take with the state working with the U.S. Department of Education. But now we're talking about all students just for that group. And by the way, the three subgroups that we're accountable for there, the African American, Hispanic, and Native American, the reason those three are selected is because their performance was below the state average.
And on down this chart, if you close that gap, but the all category declines any bit, right? Then you miss, right? So,
Well,
for example, if
That's
you
our
have,
next slide.
right?
Yeah,
If
and
you
that
have
was-
students with disabilities, right? And they do well enough to close that gap, but the students who don't fit into the category of students with disabilities go down from 89% proficient to 88% proficient, then you miss that. Is that this last?
We think so. They haven't talked about that explicitly. However, that would show up probably in not hitting your goals for all students on the first part of the slide.
Well, yeah, I mean, but if it's just a little bit, I mean, but I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's, you don't want to close the gap by one
reduce-
group doing worse. I mean,
Right.
I think that's,
Right.
I'm not
And-
saying that's a bad thing. I just
And
want
we
to be
are
sure I understand
setting,
it.
I'll show you how we're setting goals, and we will either hit or miss those goals for all of those subgroups, including the non-EL
Okay,
students, for instance.
great.
I know you're gonna get in this, but since Mark brought it up at this point. Dr. Chang, as you mentioned, like a school that has 95% free and reduced or African American or whatever, then you don't have enough data maybe within that school to show achievement. But isn't it compared not just within the school, but with the district?
It's compared within the school, but in our, for instance, let's talk about a school that's 95% African American.
Okay.
Because they're compared to all, they will have a comparison group, but that comparison group is that same group of students for the most part. So they're not going to show an achievement gap. However, as a district, if our target for African American students in a school is too low for us as a district to make it, we're going to expect greater progress for that subgroup. We want African American students across the district to show greater gains than the overall population for us as a district to make it. So we're going to use the district target as the minimum in that case. Bottom line is schools won't be shooting for lower targets because of their population being, heavily weighted for one subgroup.
In our district, that's not how it's
That's not how the state is
automatically
doing it.
done.
Statewide.
But we did it because we didn't want African Americans in one school to have a lower goal than African Americans in the district. We didn't think that was
That puts
equitable or
greater weight
fair.
on other schools to close the gap, and we expect everyone to pitch in this process.
Well, I've got another one on achievement gap, but I'll wait till you get to that.
We're
Sure.
almost there.
Okay, well, but first, I have to show how these two fit together, and this is fairly simple. So, the first question you ask in the achievement, in the absolute achievement, is whether you made both achievement gap goals, the majority of them, and the overall achievement goals. And if yes, your district is in exemplary status, you get preferential treatment. when you have flexibility requests, for instance, and they pretty much don't expect you to write plans and submit them. The majority of districts won't be there. If no, the question you ask yourself is, did I miss both achievement and gap closure? And if the answer is no, you missed one or the other, you then say, was that intermediate status, you know, those lighter red? So you didn't fall backwards, for instance, with your subgroups, and you made progress. If intermediate was an option and you've only missed one of those two, achievement or gap closure, you end up in this sort of yellow intermediate status where you have to write an improvement plan and work with the state. However, if you missed both, even if you made good progress, but you missed both, we end up on the list. Now, we don't know exactly where our district was last year because this is hypothetical. They didn't really run this. My guess is that we were probably in the intermediate category with the vast majority of other districts. Okay, then we're going to talk a little bit about achievement gaps. This is data that is from a school, not a district, but illustrates the general concept of economically disadvantaged and not economically disadvantaged. You can see here that there is a 22% gap for 2011 between these two subgroups. So we need to decrease that by 6.25%. So that really means by 1.4.
That's 1.4 percentage points that we're talking about the next.
So in other words, we would have to go to a 20.6% gap instead of a 22% gap. And there's a lot of different ways you could do that. But the way we chose to do it is, and this is an example, if 50% of the population was in ED, we would divide this 1.4% and by 2. And so the goal for ED would be this 3.5. So that's the amount the whole district needs to improve for all students. And we would add this 0.7 to it. So for the economically disadvantaged students, they would need to make a 4.2% more students would have to be hitting proficient or advanced. We would take the same thing for non-economically disadvantaged students so that we make that overall 3.5% increase. We're going to take away the 7.7 from this so that they only have to make 2.8%. Now, we have this weighted in all different ways for all the schools in our district. So if you're virtually 100% economically disadvantaged, more of that growth is going to need to come from that subgroup. But this is the way that we made the goals as low as we possibly could, and still making both achievement and gap.
But we're
Okay.
setting these for all of the schools. We don't expect them to go through this process.
No, we've done all of this and submitted, but we'll resubmit.
So in this case that's on the screen, the goal would be for the economically disadvantaged subgroup to have 34.2%.
No.
Go to the next slide.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, we want them to increase by 4.2%.
So up to 34.2 for the next year, and for the not economically disadvantaged to increase by 2.8, and then you have both met your goal to narrow the gap. Both groups have improved,
Right.
and you've met your goal of a 3.5% increase
Right.
across these two, which would include, these two would include all students,
So
right?
this is kind of the minimum goal for all
Right,
of that
right,
to happen.
but I follow that.
Okay, so what do you think happens if we hit 34.2% for our economically disadvantaged, but our not economically disadvantaged goes to 60%? Have we met the goal? We have not. We still have, so the goals are somewhat fluid. We still have to have that, the gap between them still has to to
We
be
would hit our
lessened.
achievement goal, but not our
Not our
gap
gap
closure.
Not our gap closure goal. So, schools will have numbers like this, 34.2, and the district will, but they're not fixed, unlike No Child Left Behind. You know, there's no automatic pass. We will not know until we take those tests and we look at the data, what we even need to have done.
Like in CLB though, is there a goal that in a certain number of years we get to 100%?
No, the goal for gap closure is 50% over a number,
Over
7 or 10
8
years.
years, yeah.
Some number of years.
But,
So in
but it-
8 or 10 years, what
But-
percent should be proficient or advanced?
We don't know that. The state is going to be setting annual targets now, and if a school made tremendous growth one year, that doesn't mean they get a pass the next year. There's still going to be a growth expectation after that, and that's a conversation we're going to have annually with the state.
What's our position? Do we want to see 100% of our children proficient or advanced in 10 years?
Well, obviously, we want to see.
Are we advocating for that?
I don't. Dr. Register may want to speak to. I'll give my opinion on that.
As a board, are we advocating for that? As an administration, are we advocating? Do we have?
Let me speak to that as a former teacher and principal. Nothing is 100% but taxes and debt. And we would be fooling ourselves if we say that every child is going to reach 100%. And I just don't think that we as a district can say that we expect for every child in this district, special ed, ELL, and all, it's not going to be 100%. Now, you might want to say if this is 100% trying to get there, but it's like the NCLB. They said all students would be proficient by 2014. Look how far we are away from that.
And keep in mind that basic is grade level.
Right.
Certain parts of basic are grade level. So that would be akin to saying we expect all of our students to be above average. You know, that would be fantastic.
It would.
Right.
And I applaud it
I
if we
think
did.
Michael's question, though, Mr. Hayes, Michael, whichever, is significant, but I'm glad to see you saying this is a minimum. Because if you look at, for example, economically disadvantaged versus none in 3-8 math, it's going to take 15 to 16 years to close the achievement gap at 1.9% per year. That's a long time, but at least we have something to measure it by because, I mean, you know.
That's longer than one child from first grade to 12th grade.
Oh, no question. We might not be that one child, but the gap of that group, I think, is what we're looking at. You know, I've argued this for years. I always said if we could do 1% per year, we would be there now from the time I got on the board. So I'm glad to see that we at least have that target. We may not reach it, but I think setting those as minimum figures, we really should strive to go much faster than that.
Well,
And 10 years, I mean, I said strive, I didn't say set a goal
Yeah.
of that, because I think these are very, very realistic. If we're doing anything in that direction, I can't see how we can miss these.
the state consistently uses the word ambitious but realistic targets, and you know, and we're generally talking 3 to 4 percentage point increases per year, which is much better than what we were seeing under No Child Left Behind. But at the same time, the data from across the nation under NCLB indicates that states generally weren't making these kinds of gains on an annual basis. But these are doable, and certainly with all of the resources we have in place. And one good thing with this system is you heard, unlike NCLB, if you fall short of one target, you're not necessarily doomed in the accountability system. But you have to make the majority of targets, you have to consistently be moving in the right direction. And that's more of a holistic picture than NCLB, where we could have great gains overall, but one subgroup may have tripped a flag.
Dr. Chambers, I just have
Yeah.
one more question related to this. And one of the conversations that I had in the past with my former board member, David Fox, and I don't want to, well, I'm going to say what he said. His concern was, and mine too, that in the advanced group, the gap was widening faster than it was in the proficient group. Is there anything in our approach to closing the achievement gap in the advanced group of students included in what we are doing here? Because, you know, those are the kids, not to put down proficient, I think we've got to have kids doing proficient. But when we look at the kids in the advanced group, these are generally kids who are going to college, that kind of thing.
Well,
So are we addressing that gap?
let me make a comment first, because I think under the old academic standards, the advanced group was that group going on to college, but now our proficient students are equal to or higher than our previous advanced group. Those students are generally above the state average if they're in the proficient range. So everything has shifted with the new standards. But in terms of advanced performance, we're still monitoring that, and we are making improvement in terms of advanced, just as we are with proficient.
Are we measured it, though? is what
We
I'm
are,
saying.
we are, and I'll just add that we have recommended to the state, and they are supposed to pilot this this year. We've asked that we not look just at the increase in proficient and advanced, but also the movement from proficient to advanced, and also in the percent below basic. If we have kids who are falling from basic to below basic, that's a negative. So there's a very simple computational method that we've asked them to look at, which they apparently do like, that might be used in the future. But I'll also add that value added is looking at movement of all students, and if students who are advanced are not staying advanced, or students who are proficient are not moving up to advanced, it's going to show up in our value added, which we're now all accountable for in this evaluation system. But we can provide numbers, and we plan to do that in our report, in our scorecard that we're going to be reporting as a district on each of those achievement levels, because we do think that's important.
Are charter schools included in all of this?
Yes, they are. Now, this is our district summary data from last year that the state used to set the targets that we see here. You'll see for each of those subject areas and grade levels on the first page, these are our achievement targets. You'll see the number of students who were proficient in advanced versus the number tested, or in the case of our graduates, the last row, the number who graduated versus the number who were in that cohort, and then what our percent proficient was last year. And this is all students. We're now looking at every child who takes a test, not just those who were continuously enrolled. And that next to last column that's bolded is the percentage point increase that we have to make in each area. So if you add that column to the previous column, you get the last column, which is our target for proficiency this year. So as you can see, we are expected to make growth across the board, and schools will, as a starting point, schools will have these growth targets as their targets, but depending on their population, it could go higher than that if they serve disadvantaged students in large number. Because the next slide gets into the gap closure targets. And the actual percentage of closure is consistently 6.25%. But you can see tremendous variation in the actual achievement gaps currently. When you compare our racial ethnic subgroup to all students, it's generally anywhere from the 4 to 10.5% range. But that's comparing to all students. And we know that we have a large percentage of our students in that subgroup. But then, as Mr. North pointed out, that's where we start for the other subgroups comparing to the non-disadvantaged students. And you'll see large gaps for our economically disadvantaged, 29.7% currently in 3rd through 8th grade math, for instance. And when we multiply that current gap, which is in percentage points, so let's look at economically disadvantaged versus non-economically disadvantaged 3 through 8 math. They're currently at 29.7%, that gap. That's this row right here. When we multiply that gap by 6.25%, it means we have to reduce the gap by almost 2 percentage points, 1.9 percentage points. So however well our non-economically disadvantaged students do this year on the test in math in 3rd through 8th, our economically disadvantaged students need to be 1.9% points higher than that. And the minimum that that's going to be is this target over here, 27.8, in terms of the gap. So these are pretty, pretty large gaps we see for a number of subgroups. You'll notice that for for students with disabilities in 3 through 8, the gaps are smaller. 3.5% in math, 7.5% in reading. We have a modified academic achievement standards assessment, or MOS, that helps considerably with these populations, and that assessment will be in place at least one more year. But we still have a gap to reduce. And we actually have some schools that have higher performance for students with disabilities in 3 through 8 than their non-disadvantaged students. So they'll be asked just to maintain that. But again, we're talking about this balance of raising achievement and closing the gap.
How often is this going to be evaluated and reassessed, maybe setting new targets?
Every year.
Every year.
Every year we'll get this kind of data, share it with you, and we'll be setting new targets. Hopefully in the future we'll be doing this before the school year starts. But
one of the reasons I asked that question, hopefully if we're successful in some of our efforts in metropolitan public schools to attract people back into the school system, especially from the white community and possibly non-disadvantaged community, that will change. Obviously, a lot of the comparisons here because we have larger numbers. So I think we'll have to evaluate that as we go along, because closing the achievement gap is different when you have a different population than we have now.
It certainly does. And I won't take time tonight, but I will tell you that that's one of the things we're looking at in terms of holding on to the students we have and what those demographics look like, but also what the incoming students look like demographically each year. And Tina's going to talk about our, close this with our relative recognition.
While Tina is coming, Dr. Register, what does our projection look like next year, or next year? Enrollment.
Plus 1,700. 81,000. Will be 81,000.
So we have grown by approximately 1,000, maybe more.
No, for the last 3 years, it's been closer to 1,500.
Is there an indication, Dr. Register, where these students will be coming from in terms of the economic disadvantage categories? Do we have any idea?
Well, I think, I stand to be corrected, Paul has that data. I think our percentage of free and reduced price lunch has gone down some. Is that correct?
The official number from the state is in the low 70s, low 72%. Our data actually shows it's slightly below 70%. It has to do with some of the computational methods that the state uses, but it's in that 70% range.
But am I correct that the percentage overall of free and reduced price lunches has gone down slightly
It has gone down slightly.
over the last few years?
But has not the computations changed? I mean, the standard that people are considered free and reduced lunch, have not they gone down some? No?
And I think that's constant. I don't think that's changed in the last 3 or 4 years.
No, I don't think that has
I'm
changed.
thinking of Hillsborough High School specifically.
You're thinking about Title I status maybe?
Maybe that's it.
That's a percentage that we determine based on some calculations that we can make. But the percentage of students that qualify for free and reduced price lunches is an economic scale, a family scale, family income. And that one, I'm pretty sure, has been constant for several years.
Another point about a couple of the subgroups is some of those, the numbers will change without new students coming in. There are a couple of subgroups that an individual student could be a member of economically disadvantaged one year, and their economic situation change, and they're not a member of the economic disadvantaged group the next year, right? Now, that ought to be picked up through value added, but in fact, that's the way we want to change it. We want the economic situation in Nashville-Davidson County to change so much that the family income is enough so the number of economically disadvantaged changes, right?
Yes.
But it's also with English learners that they test out, or they become once they become proficient, and they're no longer considered.
After 2 years.
After a couple of years, they're no longer considered English learners for this, right? So that individual students' categories change on some of them, on those two, right?
Special ed even, if you have a speech IEP, you probably are going to not have that after a few years if you're lucky, or
All right.
you've had something addressed. I'm going to try to go through this really quickly, the relative accountability and recognition piece. Suffice it to say that there will be high-performing reward schools, and those will be based on a success rate that's different from any of the rates we've talked about thus far. It does include science, and this will be based on 3 years of data, each year being equally weighted. Though they will be across the state. We do believe we will have some based on our preliminary list, and not just our magnets. And then you can't have a significant achievement gap, by which I mean above the state median achievement gap, and still get that status. There's also high progress reward schools, and these are based on TVOS data. So these are schools that have made exceptional progress. Both categories of these schools will be celebrated and possibly have the chance to go through the state and share what they've learned and how they did this. And so these 3-year success rates are also going to be used to identify the bottom 5% of schools. And we will have a few of these as well, hopefully fewer. So these will be calculated at the end during this summer. We have some initial results, and you've probably seen some of the news about that. I don't need to go into that. Graduation is included, again, science is included, math and reading. And we have to implement some rigorous turnaround strategies at these schools, and we've already started that process. We hope that we don't get any more priority schools, but we will not know until state rankings come out, because again, these are schools compared against each other across the state, and we have no way of knowing what the state data will look like.
What does a reward school mean?
There's 2 categories of reward school, and so if you are in the top 5% of achievement, and the basic formula is reading plus math plus science, and then if you're in high school, plus graduation rate. So
It's recognition for outstanding achievement or growth.
Okay, it doesn't mean you're gonna get any more money or
I don't
anything.
know of any financial reward.
Okay, I mean, reward sounds.
I did want to say that
Certificate
the addition of science is a real change from NCLB, and we're glad to see that added here.
But social studies isn't included?
Not at this time, but we're still under the old standards for social studies. That may change when we have new academic standards.
Okay, so if you end up in the priority, we're back to the non-success schools, the priority schools. So you would either go to the achievement school district, our own innovation zone, or have to implement a SIG turnaround model. And these will change over time. They hope to absorb everybody into the I-zone or achievement school districts over years. The state just doesn't have that capacity right now. And we could spend a whole hour talking about this, so. But we won't. And then we also have something called focus schools. And focus schools are are of three varieties. One is a high school with less than a 60% graduation rate. Thus far, we've not had any of those for the last few years. We hope to not go there. Schools with less than 5% proficient or advanced for any subgroup, we don't have any of those either, unless they have changed something. And then the vast majority of those will be schools with the largest within-school achievement gaps. So again, you won't be a focus school if you are homogeneous in terms of economics or race ethnicity, because there won't be calculations. These are weighted. So you, if you have the same achievement gap, but you're in a school with very few, let's say the achievement gap we're looking at is economically disadvantaged, that counts less than the same achievement gap, but a high, low SES school. So we do expect some schools to be focus schools in this district. It is not a death sentence. These schools are allowed to compete for $100,000 grants. We do have some schools that are listed on a preliminary list. However, the list was created before they changed certain things, such as the all versus the racial ethnic subgroup. They had compared it white, non-white. So this will change a little bit. And one last thing about the focus schools is, you know, that whole achievement gap piece I went through before, that is a safe harbor for this designation. So if you can make those 6.25% decreases in the year that they do the focus school calculation, that's a safe harbor. We have actually several schools in our district that would be reward schools, but might be focus schools. So the most negative designation trumps the more positive.
I think one of the concerns that we've all had, I assume, is these designations, you know, as it relates to failing schools, successful schools, et cetera. Is there any way we internally, and I know these are state terms, you know, reward schools, et cetera, but I'm thinking about a school that has 80 or 90% of the kids who are below proficient in 1 year go down to 40%, for example. Can we some kind of way say they a reward school or something? I mean,
we can recognize them internally.
I think we need to think about that.
Well, we are looking at our own identification of schools that goes beyond this system. We know that in any accountability system, there are going to be limitations. So we're very interested in looking at progress of our schools to look at schools that might have large percentages of students who are disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged, et cetera, that are making progress and showing relatively high achievement, not only compared to the district comparable schools, but across the state, because we can gather that data from the value-added side. So we will be looking at that. And I'm going to ask Julie to come up, but we gave you a one-page handout at the end that just kind of summarizes what we covered and how that relates to No Child Left Behind. But in the interest of time, Julie's going to just take us through the improvement planning process and kind of the schedule that's coming up for this summer. Do you want to look at that full screen? Does that work?
Thank you, and I think I gave you all a back-to-back sheet that says, so what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 months? Because this is a lot of information to absorb. So let's just take this month. This month, obviously, starting tomorrow, we're doing TCAPs, and then right after that, end of course testing. Our district, it's Paul and Tina's office, determined these new accountability targets under both absolute and relative for both the district and for each one of those schools. They submitted those to the Department of Education, the state, and we are now in a process of negotiation to get the final target set for both the district and the schools. Those targets are for the test we're taking right now. So we're getting targets and negotiating targets with children sitting in classes taking the exact test that will determine whether we meet those targets or not. That is because this was just negotiated with the U.S. Department of Ed, so we are kind of behind, obviously, the schedule. Because of what we're trying to move to in the district, and I think the state is also moving this, what we want to do is turn around student achievement. It's very important to obviously have a very effective school improvement planning process. But in many ways, schools across Tennessee were more concerned about the actual plan, the document, than what that plan was supposed to do, which was drive student achievement. Because of that, we approached the state and said we want a simpler template, something that condenses what is required but drives an action plan so we can begin to work with our schools to really make interventions and do things that can help student achievement. At the same time, we believe that there were certain pieces of data that actually were missing that schools needed to look at during the planning process. So let me give you two examples of data that relate to two subgroups that we are struggling, as many school districts are, addressing high achievement. That's our English language learners and our students with disabilities. So we're now going to be asking our schools, by providing them with data on, for example, the English Language Development Assessment. That's called the ELDA. That's for English language learners. They take it every year. There are targets for improvement of the kind of English language proficiency students have from year to year. This test is a better indication for our students that are still at low levels of English proficiency of the progress they're making than expecting them to test proficient on a TCAP. We're going to give our schools now that data, every school, and say, now not just look at the TCAP for your English language learners, look at what they're doing with the English language proficiency. The same things with students with disabilities. Dr. Register, our district has committed to one of the most effective strategies for improving the achievement of those students is to have more students with disabilities included in regular general education courses. So we now are providing every school with the percent of students with disabilities at that school that are included in general education classes. And we're going to be asking schools to review that data, because we believe by reviewing that data and improving and increasing the percent of these students that are effectively included, we can drive the TCAP data and the achievement of students with disabilities. Each one of our schools now will address 3 goals in their school improvement plan. One is absolute accountability. Look at what we're giving you for your AMOs in math and reading language arts, and tell us what you're going to do next school year with the resources available to meet those targets. Second goal will be your gap closure. Looking at what the district has set and negotiated with the state for your school on gap closure, what interventions are you going to do in your school and use of resources to close the gap? And the third goal is going to be around school culture. We have a lot of data, such as the TEL survey, which measures how the teachers look at the school culture and climate every year. We're going to ask them to use that. Things such as graduation rate, attendance, discipline, school surveys. And for our schools that are participating in the tribal process, they have other additional data that will be used in the school improvement planning process. We understand that the school culture affects student achievement, so we're going to be asking our schools to look at that data and come up with strategies to help improve that school culture so that achievement will be supported. Now, we just about a month ago came to you with our application for both the iZone and for school improvement grant funding. We met with the state today, and we believe that we think it's very promising that we'll get approval of our application by next Monday. So we're in the process right now of making revisions. That grant, or those two grants, are a 3-year grant. So the I-Zone and the 7 priority schools improved in the school improvement grant will be identified as priority schools for the next 3 years minimum. But they will also be in the innovation zone, and they will receive these additional funds to help support rapid improvement in student achievement. So that's happening this month. Yes.
How much money are we talking?
Well, that's exactly what we're in the process of negotiating right now. They haven't, right. We don't know exactly. The amount that was put in the application and that we asked for your approval of about a month ago or so, can't remember, it will not be that much because they have a limited amount of funds, and they're going to have to look at Memphis, Nashville, and the Achievement School District itself to decide how much each entity will be allocated. Now, next month, we still don't know how much money we're getting under our No Child Left Behind, Title I and Title II. We hope to, by next month, know those allocations. We will then, next month, after TCAP testing, Paul's office will provide each school with, here are your targets for the tests that your students just took. It's a little late, but at least we're going to give it to them to give them an idea of what those targets look like. We're going to use our new template and help them write these new kind of revised school improvement plans. And if you go to the next sheet, oops. Okay, as we go into June, it looks like here we go. As we go into June, the schools will have to submit those school improvement plans to us. We do review them. We work with them, both our in the innovation zone and with my colleagues in leadership and learning. We review those plans and we go through a process to approve them. Now in July, the results of the test and this new accountability system will come back to us at the district level. The state will determine, did the district as a whole make these new absolute accountability targets, or AMOs? And then they will tell us whether each school, the targets that we set, the AMOs, was met or not in July. That's going to happen annually. And after they tell us whether we at the district and each school met these targets, then they turn right around and we set the targets for the next school year. Now, unfortunately, that's not how schools plan. They plan in the spring. And in the summer, most teachers and students are off when all of this data comes back. So the one disadvantage to this system compared to AYP is under No Child Left Behind AYP, we at least knew where those targets were. This system, every year we're going back and having to renegotiate the targets for the next school year. So that also means that we're going to have to work with schools, and if necessary, they're going to have to revise their plans very quickly if needed, if their targets aren't met or their strategies are not aligned with what the data now is showing and their new targets. Now, this summer, again, what's going to happen, which both Tina and Paul talked about, is we're going to use the relative accountability. That happens every 3 years. So schools this summer will be identified again as priority. Currently, we have 9 schools identified as priority. Those were based on 2 years' worth of data. That was because the state needed to get started soon. Those 9 schools will continue to be identified as priority. However, in the summer, new schools could fall in the bottom 5% based on a 3-year average, And so new schools could be identified as priority this summer. Now, we hope that no additional schools in metropolitan Nashville that will happen with, but we do want to give you a heads up that that calculation is going to happen again this summer, summer 2012, and then will happen again 3 years later, summer 2015. When a school gets identified as priority this summer, it stays as priority for at least 3 years.
So this summer, from this year's tests, no schools are allowed to climb out of the priority
Yes,
status.
that's
But
right.
they are allowed to fall into it.
Right. This is an anomaly because this is
Because it's
just implementing the system. So even if a school that was identified as priority based on 2 years' worth of data, let's say they really pulled up their achievement, and when they did their 3-year average, they're not in that bottom 5%.
Right.
Maybe they're in the bottom 7%, but not the 5%. Unfortunately, they are still identified as priority, and only new schools might be added to that list.
Ms. Shepherd?
I need a little clarification. Now, the only schools that would need to do some revisions are those that have not met their relative accountability goals, correct?
No, every year, remember those absolute accountability goals, we set them at the district level, and then we set them for each school, so we meet our district goal. If a school really misses its mark on the absolute accountability goals we set for them, we, not the state, the district, we're going to go back to that school and say, we really want to sit down with you. We want to re-look at your plan. We want to see how you are planning next year to use your resources, your structure, your interventions to ensure that next year you'll be able to meet your new targets because this year you missed them. Now, we're not talking about if you miss them a little bit. We're talking about if it's obvious the school is not on the right track to meet its annual goals.
So you're not concerned about fallout or logistics or anything about having to do a major revision like that?
Well, I think this is where this is going to happen every summer, and this is a more differentiated approach to the way the district will work with its schools. Am I concerned about it? For example, if a school uses Title I funds and say they want to put in let's say a certain kind of very expensive intervention or personnel, but that's really not aligned with where the needs are, yes, I'm concerned, but I think at that point we need to look at how big the gap is between where their real performance is showing and what they're proposing to do and to work with them on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Kendall?
Yeah, on the, if new schools are added, Dr. Carter, if
Yes.
new schools are added, say this summer, and we've applied for this grant, and we get X number of dollars, will these schools also share in that grant?
Okay, and that gets down, well, at the end of it, if we do have new schools that are identified as priority this summer, there will be another opportunity for a school improvement grant, and for those schools to apply for that grant, and then for us to make a determination of whether those schools would also be included in the innovation zone. It also means the state, remember the state can determine they're going to put a priority school in the achievement school district also at any time. And I think Paul was making the point, for schools, the real accountability is through the relative accountability system and when they end up in the priority status. When a school ends up in priority, they really, we in the school have a lot less degrees of authority, of determination of what's going to happen. We propose, and I think we've been very successful at proposing an innovation zone and saying that we're going to take an aggressive approach with these schools. But in the long run, it really is going to be under the state law and the accountability waiver. It really is the state that has the authority to make final determinations on those schools. But yes, they have saved some school improvement grant funds, the state has, to ensure if any new schools are identified, they have the resources necessary to address those needs of those new priority schools.
How much authority, you mentioned authority, how much authority do we have locally? Let's say we have two schools that are pretty much the same, you know, in terms of their achievement, and we want to make a determination as to what we do, either do turnaround, we do charter, we do whatever. How much authority do we have in that? Is it really just up to the state which one they want to do with that?
Well, this time, and Dr. Register could really speak to this time, they were we came, and this is where I think we've been very successful under Dr. Register's leadership and your guidance. We've taken a proactive approach with the state. We have gone to them. We started the innovation zone. They took that concept and built it into a waiver, and now are using it in other places in the state. So I think taking a very proactive approach that's based on research, but at the same time is bold, has been very successful. But in the long run, if the state makes a determination they want to turn a school, convert it to a charter school, directly run it under the Achievement School District, under Metropolitan Nashville, the state is not currently proposing directly running any of our schools, but in another school district in the state, they are directly running some of that school district's priority schools. So.
Mr. Hayes and then Dr. Gentry.
Thank you. I want to make sure I'm clear on this. The test data that will come back over the summer is TCAP test data.
Yes.
And historically, 4 or 5 years ago, that used to come back late summer, early fall, and then as we kind of shifted it, there was a year or two recently where it lagged kind of significantly in the returns to us. Is that right?
Well, Paul, you want to speak to
With the change in academic standards, yes, there was a lag as they set new standards. But now we should get things in much more timely fashion. The goal is to have everything summarized by June. I would anticipate July that we'll have.
Well, and so it leads me into the next two questions, which are somewhat related. To the extent that we have the data back quickly, I think that could be certainly if we look out over the next decade as we grow our charter schools, our ability to look at that in real time and make a decision. If we have a painful decision to make around guiding or closing or having discussions with the charter, that would be very helpful to receive it in July, so that we could, if students have to go somewhere else, or if the parents want to make a different choice, they'd have the ability to do so and be informed. So I'm delighted to hear that we've got a pledge from the state to get the data back quickly. So maybe that wasn't a question, it was more of a statement. But the question, how our teacher review process that's now incorporating testing data, is our end of year review May, June, or does it take into consideration real-time test data and occur in July?
No, the teacher effect data and how that falls.
Right, I mean, teacher effectiveness, and that's a big part of their annual evaluation.
There's a certain percentage we're going to get the 35% that factors in from teacher evaluation day into the teacher evaluation system from TVOS back this summer. There's still another 15% of the evaluation system data that can be value added, can be something else, which will be delayed. But in terms of making decisions, and Dr. Register, I don't know if you can speak to this. We're going to have that data back this summer, but I don't know exactly the timeline in terms of making any decisions.
And really, to the extent
It's problematic that we're 50% of a teacher's evaluations to be based on student data, and it won't be back by the time school's out. So that's one area where we're really pushing for a more timely return of data. individual teachers are evaluated on different criteria. Teachers and principals had an opportunity, particularly those that aren't in grade levels or subject areas that have standardized tests, had some flexibility in determining what criteria are used for their evaluation. For example, high school teachers may use graduation rate as a part of their evaluation criteria. Graduation rate can't be determined until the end of the summer because it's based on 4 years and a summer's worth of data. So graduation data won't be back until sometime in the fall. Tina, do you know when, or Paul?
Well, they've given themselves till January to get that back.
So, so the point is that you've got a couple of different components that go into a teacher's evaluation. You've got the observation process that we're going through now. And that evaluation process will be finished by the end of the school year. Teachers will have their observation results back, and that will be posted to their account. Their data may be back and likely will be back in part and not in part. And so that the results of that data will be added to each teacher's account until it's complete. And so a lot of the teacher evaluations for a lot of teachers will not be finally completed until next fall sometime.
So, I guess I believe that the July date is a good one. What are we going to do with it? You know, if we've got data that comes back and it's really not complete until the fall.
So practically speaking, well, first let me make this point, that if you have, Gene, you help me with this if I'm incorrect, but if you have bad observation data, if you have a particular person who scores very poorly on a pretty rigorous process of observation and evaluation this year, that does constitute enough information to take action against a teacher. But the total process won't be complete until later. And the expectation is that principals will have a follow-up or a second conference when all of that data is complete to finalize the evaluation instrument.
So could we have, is it fair to say September, October, the evaluation's complete and we know, and if we had a bad teacher, that before December, we'd be able to take a significant action so that we don't have a whole nother school year of having an ineffective teacher in the classroom?
Well,
and I know that's a difficult question.
I think the data won't be complete. We shouldn't expect the data to be complete on all teachers until sometime in December or January.
So February?
So
how quickly after it's completed?
So I think we have to get to the point where we look at evaluation as a cycle, an ongoing cycle, and that there's not only one time in the year when you can take action if it's necessary. I think we have to look to that as we go forward. The other thing, practically speaking, that I think we really have to push for and encourage is more timely return of data. And I think, and what you have to understand now is we're not through with the first cycle of evaluation. I think the weakest part of that is how you tie each individual teacher's evaluation to student achievement. Now, let's talk about the art teacher at an elementary school. How do you tie that teacher's evaluation to student achievement? And we're still in the process of determining exactly how to do that. The state is still in the process of determining exactly how to do that. So I think we have to assess it at the end of this year. We have to look at it this summer. We have to see where the strengths and weaknesses in the system are and correct, and take corrective action in the process.
Dr. Gentry?
So you mentioned about, our ability to be proactive, but I think we're being very proactive in what to do about our schools that are not doing well, right? We've been very proactive in kind of getting ahead of the state's strategies and games about what are we going to do about our schools that don't do well. And I think we have done a good job there. And I remember Dr. Chang is coming before us and us being very excited at the end of a meeting where he presented a lot of tools that the district was using to predict performance in our students, and we don't have that now, right? So we don't have as strong, maybe, of tools, or you haven't gotten to speak to them yet, about what we're doing to be more proactive in the school's performance ahead of the test and ahead of things. And I hear so much variation, even once we think we know, right? Mm-hmm. We don't really know until after the test has been taken, what those benchmarks and goals turn out to be.
I'll just say that we still have discovery education, assessment data, formative data. We have made some modifications during the year in some of the reporting to try to anticipate this new system in the way we report, looking at the same types of subgroups, comparisons of economically disadvantaged to non-disadvantaged. But it's been such a fluid process all through the year that there really wasn't a lot of time and we're still negotiating our final targets. But what we've told schools is, I showed that slide that talked about raising achievement of all students and narrowing that achievement gap. We've told them that it's going to be in probably the 3 to 4 percentage point range overall, and that 6.25% is going to be there. We have some idea of what's coming, but it's just such a different system that we'll have to see how it plays out.
And I guess to that end, I would really be hesitant to be gung-ho to factor these scores into a teacher's evaluation until we really understand what the trending of it is, and are we doing our part to be able to help the teachers prepare the students under this new rubric. I mean, I think it just needs to be a joint decision between you and Dr. Register, and not just saying because test scores are a factor, we're just going to go in. I mean, if that's a negotiation to have, I think that would be one, to give us some time to just understand and wrap our arms around the new testing process. Again, how we can be more proactive in this space to help our teachers do their part to at least have a chance at being successful under this new
So the
process.
whole world changed on teacher evaluation. Right. We went from once every 5 years for a tenured teacher to every year for every teacher. And I think the part of the process that I trust is the observation and conferencing part, what we've done now, because we've put a great effort into helping our principals learn how to do this, to be expert observers and evaluators. We've worked with our teachers to do this, and I think we're in better shape than almost all of our neighbors and almost everyone in the state of Tennessee for being able to do that. What we cannot trust yet, I'll use that word, is the student achievement data related to individual teachers. And until we get to the place that we can trust that, then I think you're right.
Mr. Nolan?
I have three things too. I think we'll go pretty quick. If test results are going to count for students, part of their semester grade on their report card, we're going to have to get the results back pretty quick, aren't we?
We will be getting what's called a quick score report. It won't be any kind of summary data, but we will get a roster with a numerical. The test score will be converted to a numerical grade, and that should be here at least a week before the end of school. It has happened at the high school level with end of course exams in the past.
Will there still be something similar to the No Child Left Behind choice and transportation for schools and for priority schools, that sort of thing? Are we going to?
Okay, so the waiver that the state submitted was approved so that those requirements are not in required anymore. I mean, we as a district could decide to do public school choice and supplemental educational services. The only thing we are absolutely required to do is that those children now that are currently in schools where they have exercised public school choice, they are guaranteed that they are allowed, if they and their parents choose, to continue at that school of choice until the final grade, like from elementary, be 4th, middle, 8th.
Okay, third question, I'm sorry. The relative accountability. There are, is that 5%, there's a 5% reward for achievement, right? 5% for value added. There's 10% focus schools, and there's 5% for priority schools. Okay. Is that 5% high schools and also 5% of the
K through 8
K through 8?
schools.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. And
Yeah, I believe that's the case.
That's it.
So there's two groups.
They
There's
have
high
two
school
different
and-
groups, yes, and it's 5% at each of those levels.
Okay. And I've stated my concern before about comparing middle schools and elementary schools and all bunching them up to find a 5%.
And I'll just say, we share that concern because the data shows that proficiency levels are typically lower at the middle school level, particularly in math, and we have shared that with the state, but right now they're all on one scale.
Okay, now, and if your school is categorized by the lowest category, it falls into lowest group, right? The focus schools. If there's a school that is in the priority schools, but also has bad achievement gap. It's a priority school.
It's a priority school. It's not a focus school. Yeah.
Does that add another school to the focus group? So it's not really the 10% worst at that group. It is
the additional
after you
10%.
take out the priority schools, there is a 10% focus school, right?
Correct.
Okay. And do you go down the list to get the focus schools? For example, high schools with a graduation rate below 60%. If that fills up to 10%, do you stop there with the high schools, or do you somehow go on to the achievement gap? Do you start at the top and go down, or is there some weird calculation?
This year, in the preliminary calculations, that's exactly what they did. So they took, X number of schools had 60%, Y number of schools had 5%, and then the remainder to make up a total of 10%
Right.
for achievement gap. Whether they will continue that, I don't know.
Okay.
I want to follow up on,
Mr. Kendall.
I want to follow up on Mr. North's first question. Understanding that NCLB does not require this choice piece in terms of, going to if you're in a failing school, a so-called failing school, to another school, we still have the funds for that? I mean,
Okay, are you talking about the public school choice, either choosing another school or the
Right.
supplemental educational services?
No,
Okay.
choosing another school.
So for the children that still are currently enrolled in a school of choice that we are currently this year providing transportation for, right? They're using buses. Some parents or students are, if we don't have a bus, are given mileage. That is also an option for the school district and to either continue at least some kind of transportation for those children or not. So that's a flexibility under the budget. And those determinations, obviously, we will be presenting to you when we finally find out what the Title I allocation, how much money we're getting. We will present to you our suggested recommended budget for your approval, and at that time, you will see, right now, I think tentatively, we are hoping to include money in the budget for transportation for public school choice, even though it's not required. I think we've got to first look at how much money do we have, and we don't know that yet.
But it is our intention not to pull the rug out or pull the child off the bus. If we've got children that are going by no child left behind choice now, we want to phase that out with transportation. That's what we're thinking. Now, that's obviously that could be a board decision and something to discuss at other places, but we're not considering continuing the public school choice for low performance, though. That would become a part of our pupil assignment plan.
Okay, that was the gist of my question.
Yes.
What is our future intent with that? Because
Right, so
I know it can be a very costly.
Right, and so the district and those kinds of things has the flexibility to make those determinations, but it's not required anymore, and I think that's what we're talking about. And so those decisions would come to the board to be made.
Okay, when you bring those back to the board for us to approve of the recommendation, the student pupil assignment will be a part of that, of
Well,
what we'll be
okay.
looking at.
That's not our intention to
Not for Title I
continue.
budgets.
Yeah. We feel like what we're trying to do is unify our student choice options anyway. We're going to a single process so that every parent can make multiple choices for any child on the same form. To simplify the process, to help parents understand what the process is. It's a procedural thing, but it's not our intention to continue the old No Child Left Behind low performance choice when such a large percentage of our children have choices anyway.
Right.
The other way to look at that is we're holding schools and we're being held accountable for not having those low performing schools.
Right.
So the goal is to work out of those, to not have those.
I guess the reason for my question, Dr. Reddish, is that the reason I asked about the pupil assignment, I just want to be sure that when we eliminate this process, of providing the transportation, that we don't have students in an area where there are choices that they can reach without transportation, that they're limited. In other words, a child lives in an area and we say, okay, you got choice to 4 schools, but all 4 of those schools are in the priority zone, for example, or whatever. Some kind of way we've got to work out that these kids have choices to higher performing schools, as they do under NCLB. That was my only concern. That reason I asked about pupil assignment, because I can envision that a child who lives in a certain area and doesn't have transportation that we provide now can't get to those other schools, that high performing schools.
We've gone a few minutes past our time, but I'll just end with, let's hope that we can bring all of the schools up to where we would like for them to be and not be low performing. So it's a lot of work. Thank you so very much. We appreciate everything. Just 1 or 2 announcements. The executive session we will hold immediately after this meeting. I just wanted to remind you of that. And also our next regular board meeting is Tuesday, May 8th at 5 p.m. And instead of a work session in May, we will have our second board meeting Tuesday, May 29th to receive the charter school recommendations from the Office of Innovation. And that meeting will begin at 4 p.m. So we will send you a reminder on that. And thank you so very much, Dr. Changas, for all the great information. And Ms. McCarger and Dr. Stenson, we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Board members.